Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Lati Akeridoluale. The headlines. Ukraine is to change some of its military plans after the leak of highly classified Pentagon documents. Officials in Moscow say 75% of Bakhmut is now controlled by Russia. And China warns Taiwan against possible independence as it ends a 3-day military drill around the island. We begin with news that Ukraine might amend some of its military plans after the leak of highly classified Pentagon documents. Ukrainian presidential aide Mikhailo Podolyak said Ukraine's strategic plans remained unchanged, but that more specific tactical plans were always subject to change. Mr. Podolyak said, quote, "There are strategic tasks, those are unchangeable, but operational and tactical scenarios are constantly refined based on an assessment of the situation on the battlefield, resource provision, intelligence, data on the enemy's resources, amongst others." He adds that right now it's impossible to reassess plans because they are only being worked out now. One of the documents reveals that the United States has been spying on Mr. Zelensky, and the presidential aide said that is unsurprising, adding that Ukrainian officials are deeply frustrated about the leak. Meanwhile, Russia said it launched attacks on multiple fronts and destroyed one US-made artillery system, while Ukraine claims its forces repelled Russian attacks in various directions. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continued their military operation in multiple directions, including Kupiansk, Krasliman, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. It adds that the Russian army destroyed many Ukrainian armored fighting vehicles, one US-made M777 artillery system, and other Ukrainian equipment and facilities. Russian air defenses downed 2 high-mobility artillery rocket systems during the day, adding that multiple Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles have also been shot down. On the same day, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces issued a statement saying that the Ukrainian troops repelled multiple Russian attacks in 4 directions, including Liman and Bakhmut. The Ukrainian Air Force and its missile and artillery troops launched strikes on the concentration areas of Russian troops and military equipment, as well as ammunition depots, air defense positions, and other targets, and shot down a number of Russian UAVs of various types. And the Russian installed head of the Moscow-controlled part of Ukraine's Donetsk region has said that Russian forces now control more than 75% of the besieged city of Bakhmut. The battle for Bakhmut has been one of the bloodiest of the 13-month conflict, drawing comparisons with
German negotiations. So this is not the first case when US is spying on allies. Of course, it's unpleasant. Of course, it influences relations between the countries, but at the same time, it is not a real surprise because we already had cases before.
The other thing, of course, is that, I mean, militarily, we've been talking about Bakhmut over the last couple of weeks. In fact, for most of this year, 2023, we've been talking about Bakhmut because that has become some kind of battleground, war of attrition going on there. And both parties seem to think that, you know, for one reason or the other, they shouldn't let go of Bakhmut. Russia wants to capture the town. The Ukrainians don't want to lose it. But now the Russians claim that they have 75% of it under control. The Ukrainians, of course, have continuously said that they want to grind down the Russians there and make them lose as much equipment and personnel as possible, but that ultimately they may have to give it up. What's your own reading of that situation? I mean, looking at it from outside.
The situation is extremely worrisome, of course, and a lot of losses. But for Ukraine, it's not so much a symbolic to have a ground or to hold the ground. especially if you read the recent news about the new Russian tactic. They announced that the new Russian tactic will be scored airs. So actually it's not, again, not about people who live in a city, but just capturing ground which is completely destroyed. So on the Russian side, this is a symbolic gesture of having ground. For Ukraine, it was very much important because it allowed other parts of the front line to prepare for the counter-offensive, for counter-offense. Because the whole attention, there are several hot spots. It's not only Bakhmut, it's also Avdiivka and around Liman region. So there are 2 or 3 hot spots where Russians are concentrating their efforts. And this allowed to, first of all, to destroy a lot of manpower and gunpower, but also have a break and think about possibilities of counteroffensive at other parts of the front line.
While all of this is going on, it always comes as a surprise when it happens. It has happened several times in the last 13 or going to 14 months now. Even as the conflict goes on, both sides continue to exchange prisoners of war. Most recently, 200 prisoners of war were exchanged with Russia by Ukraine. When it first happened, the very first time, there were those who thought, it was something that could be built upon. That never happened, but it has continued to happen. This exchange of prisoners has continued to happen. Why do you think it has remained just that, a symbol of possible goodwill without being built upon?
This symbolic goodwill is also extremely limited. So Ukraine is using its all possibilities or all possible contacts. First of all, Ukraine asks for returning thousands of kids which were taken or moved to Russian Federation without any legal premises. But another issue, which is, for example, was not discussed, that Ukraine proposed to exchange also Muslim soldiers because it's a Ramadan period, and for Muslims, it's very important religious period. So Ukraine came up with a proposal to exchange Muslim soldiers on both sides, but Russia refused. So the possibilities of exchanges are very limited, but Ukraine, of course, uses any possibility to return as much as possible Ukrainian citizens back home.
Each time there is this prisoner exchange, we see, a number of injuries. Part of some of the prisoners of war that are exchanged, have injuries. Some, significant injuries, others maybe not so significant. But that brings up the issue of health care. And the United Nations has continued to express worry about the state of healthcare facilities, attacks on healthcare facilities and healthcare personnel. Already, of course, these are limited in number, to start off with, and then now they're being reduced by this damage and the attacks. What can you tell us about the situation on the ground? I know you're not in Ukraine, but I know that you have very good links on the ground there. What can you tell us about that, the situation with healthcare within the country, especially when you pointed out that the weather is also not, completely conducive for quite a lot of things?
So in those parts which are close to frontline and also in the south of the country, we also have, on the top of the healthcare, we also have problems with clean water, which is also part of the healthcare issues. And we have a lot of infrastructure which is being shelled, which does not allow people who flee from those regions, either to center or western parts of the country or abroad, to return. If you have elderly, if you have people who have to receive health care, then these people cannot return to the places which they left. and it creates a protracted situation of displacement both within the country and outside of the country.
That is true, but then on an everyday basis, I mean, we're talking about the effect on the military, for example, to start off with. I mean, when we're talking about prisoners of war, we're talking about exchange of people who are in the military. But then on an everyday basis with civilians who are still in most of Ukraine.
So this is the lines, but not very severe, because volunteers and international organizations are trying to be their best to bring as much of medicine as possible into the country. But of course, if we are talking about those regions which are closer to the fight, to the front line, then of course civilians are also affected. And it also takes much longer time, because quite often those who are wounded, they have to transport not to the nearest hospital, because these hospitals are destroyed, but they have to transport them through the country towards the center or west, and only there they could receive a proper treatment. So it also influences both civilians extremely, especially in those very close cities to the front line, where practically all hospitals are destroyed.
Indeed. Now, you're an academic, Victoria, and it came as a surprise. Of course, before the war, before the invasion by Russia started last year, a lot of Nigerian students were studying in the Ukraine, just like a lot of other countries in Africa and elsewhere around the world were studying in Ukraine for many reasons. And then many of them, of course, had to flee once the invasion took place. But I understand now that quite a number of them have returned, and that academic activities are going on, if not completely smoothly, but they are going on somehow within Ukraine. What can you tell us about that? Because for most people, the expectation would be that the conflict would have meant academic activities could possibly take place online.
We have different situations. For example, we have universities which had to move from occupied territories towards center or west of the country, and then those cities would host them. And of course, part of the activities will be happening online, taking into account that students, not all present in the country, some of them are refugees outside of the country, similarly with lecturers. So all of them are practicing hybrid forms of education. And I think those institutes or those universities which could restart their teaching are extremely lucky, because there were you're saying rightly, that there were a lot of international students who were receiving their education there. For example, I just recently visited dentist, and the person helping the dentist was a student who came from Egypt to Ukraine to study medicine, but he could not finish his studies because of the war. And he was extremely desperately saying that, unfortunately, if he would to restart in Germany, it will take extremely long time, and a lot of proofs that he already had some courses, so it's close to impossible. And he said, I miss only 1 year of study, so I wish so much if I could continue my education, receive diploma, and then proceed with this diploma, my further career in Germany. I think there are many cases like this, and Ukrainian universities are trying their best to reestablish educational process and to help those who were studying to finish their studies and receive their diplomas.
Now, the refugees that you mentioned, because you talked about refugees a little bit earlier on in our conversation, they were front and center in the news at the beginning. I mean, and I'm talking about Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian refugees, all those who had to flee the country, and then those who have remained in the country, but they are not at home. They're not where they traditionally or normally live. They've had to move because of, of the situation. Now, is there any change in their situation? I know a lot of people fled to Poland. Many other European countries opened their doors to many of these refugees, like the UK and the US and so on. Is there a situation now where you think that many of these people, both within Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, have kind of settled into the places where they have been able to get to and found safety?
So the situation is very different, even that Europe had this temporary protection directive, but implementation of this temporary protective depends on each country. So country by country, the conditions differ drastically. And in many cases, countries, for example, such as Austria or as Poland, right now give very little social benefits or assistance to refugees. And it's not so easy to find a proper job and to pay rent, and also to pay living expenses. So in some countries, situation is very problematic, and people are considering moving to another country, so trying to get back to safe places of Ukraine. If we're talking about UK, it's also an issue, because in UK there was a program of hosting people for 6 months, and now this program is over, and actually there are a lot of homeless people right now who are desperately looking for at least some place to stay, because in England, even if you have a job, you quite often cannot pay your rent for apartments. And similarly in US, many of those refugees received visas with a particular period of time, 1 year. And those visas are ending, so now it will be a lot of discussions how to prolong, how to stay in safe places. So there are many issues with Ukrainian refugees, both in Europe and across the other continents.
My final question to you, of course, will be related to that. And of course, that relates to the fact that you are in Germany. Now, in Europe, Germany is the richest country. It has the strongest economy, and it did receive quite a number of Ukrainians in the immediate aftermath of the start of this war. But speaking broadly, not about Germany in particular, but speaking broadly, what is your feeling about the situation in terms of support by these European countries for Ukraine and Ukraine's battle to remain independent of Russia and to be able to secure its territory? I asked that question particularly against the background of what you just told me about the issue of the refugees and some of the temporary measures that were put in place having issues. And then, of course, many of them, nobody estimated that the war would last this long. So many of them are now expiring, and there's some level of political difficulty in renewing some of those things.
So we do not observe radically changing moods toward the refugees. Specifically, you have to remember that absolute majority, around 80% of those who are fleeing are women with kids. So it's a very special category, which quite often has a lot of compassion and support. But at the same time, we have some debates about the economical issues right now. Polish agricultural workers announced a protest on the Ukrainian border. They closed the crossing point for 1 day, and they are actually warning that they will do it for a longer period of time, which creates a lot of issues with humanitarian aid and many other issues. Because of the grain deal, because part of the Ukrainian grain was sold in European markets as well, which brings prices down, and they started to protest. So you see that we do have support for refugees, but there are also a lot of new developments linked to the shortages in the economy.
Indeed. Victoria Sereda, as always, a unique perspective. Thank you for your insight into the various issues that have come up this morning. Thank you, and do continue to stay safe out there in Berlin, Germany. Thank you. And after the break, Russian opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza, facing 25 years in jail, says he has no regrets. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. A warm welcome back. The U.S. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel says Russia has not granted U.S. consular officials access to Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Geskovich since he was detained late last month and is in violation of international law. Mr. Patel told reporters at a regular press briefing that Moscow had over the weekend formally notified Washington of the detention, but that the United States is still seeking consular access to Mr. Geskovich, who has been detained since March 29 on espionage charges. The Wall Street Journal has denied that Mr. Geskovich was spying.
And what I can say is that we are still continuing to seek consular access. At this point, it is a violation of Russia's obligations under our consular convention and a violation against international law. We have stressed the need for the Russian government to provide this access as soon as possible. This is something that we're continuing to raise with them. It is a violation. We believe that it is a matter of human dignity to ensure that Mr. Gershkovich can meet with consular officers.
What do? Do you have any recourse at all?
We have a number of tools at our disposal, Matt, to hold the Russian Federation accountable broadly, obviously. But again, this is a consular issue that we are working through appropriate channels.
In Russia, opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza says he stands by all of his political statements, including those he made against Russia's war in Ukraine, which led him to face 25 years in jail. Mr. Kara-Murza said, quote, "I subscribe to every word that I have said that I am incriminated for today," citing his fight against the war and President Vladimir Putin. In his last words to the court, he said, "Not only do I not repent for any of it, I am proud of it." 41-year-old Mr. Kara-Murza is accused of several charges, including treason and spreading false information about the Russian army. Meanwhile, a Russian court has sentenced two former officials to 19 years in prison for throwing Molotov cocktails at a town hall in protest against military mobilization. The sentence is the heaviest punishment handed out so far for this type of attack, of which there have been several dozens since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. In September last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization to prop up forces in Ukraine, leading to a mass exodus of men from Russia to avoid being sent to the front lines. Let's now talk to Captain Bish Johnson. Captain Johnson, of course, is a retired U.S. Army captain. He's also a national defense and military strategist. He joins us from our Abuja studio. Good morning to you, Captain Johnson. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning.
Let me begin with the military situation on the ground and the leak of this U.S. strategic classified document. It must have come as an embarrassment to the United States, and more importantly, it must have come as an embarrassment too to Ukraine to have these documents, which include strategic, tactical plans and U.S. communications and all of that, and the fact that the U.S. was indeed spying on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It was monitoring his communications and all of that. For it to now, all of that to be in the public glare, does it have the echo of WikiLeaks, do you think?
Absolutely, you're right. I was even going to say that. You know, You see, this kind of leaks, particularly from the US, is becoming too often and too frequent. You know about Edward Snowden, you know about Chelsea Manning, you know, all these leaks are becoming too frequent. And it does not portend well for the US to constantly have this kind of leaks, particularly of such classified information with the potential to cause a lot of damage to the national security, particularly in terms of sources of information, you know, relationship and trust with allies, and of course, disclosure of barrel plan. So that should be of a very serious concern to the United States government.
With reference to the fact that they were spying on Vladimir Zelensky, they were monitoring his communications. For some who have spoken about it since it came to light, that would presuppose that, you know, they weren't 100% sure of the position he was taking. And my last guest before you did point out that the United States, again, had some kind of history of this. Not too long ago, they were monitoring the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and that created a problem between the US and Germany, which has not completely been, you know, wiped off. Before that, it was the French president, Emmanuel Macron. So again, I don't know how all of this plays in your mind, because military cooperation depends a great level on trust, doesn't it?
Sure, I agree with you. The trust is very necessary, but I have to tell you that, look, personally, I am not surprised that the U.S., you know, was spying on the Ukrainian president. Look, the United States is spending a lot of money and resources in this Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so America will make sure that Ukraine is successful. Now, spying on allies is not something that is not a surprise. It's not something that is new. It has always been there, you know, where you spy on allies. The problematic part of it is this one that is leaked out to the public and then push the relationship between America and its allies in danger. But that has always been the case. There's always going to be those kind of, surveillance operations on allies to keep a tab on them, even as much as you're also spying on your foes to also keep a tab on them. Now, we just mentioned the ones in the past. Those are the ones that we're aware of. Don't be surprised that there are still more that we are not aware of. But that is the nature of the beast. You know, that's the nature of intelligence operation. You know, you don't just spy on your foes. You also want to know what your allies are doing.
Indeed. Now, the other thing, of course, has to do with the supply of equipment. You and I, a couple of weeks ago, discussed when there was quite a lot of noise, pardon me if I use that phrase, at the time, about the supply of tanks and whether aircraft should join them and all of that. And on that occasion, you had told us that, yes, you know, there's the announcement and then the actual deployment, you know, is not going to immediately follow. That has proved to be correct, because here we are several weeks down the line. Some have counted it is more than 10 weeks, in some cases 12 weeks down the line after the initial announcements were made. You know, very few of the tanks that were expected, you know, have arrived in Ukraine, talk less of being deployed to the conflict.
Yeah, that again too is not unusual. There is no way those weapons are going to be brought into Ukraine without first and foremost training the Ukrainian soldiers who are going to man those weapons. You don't deploy those weapons and they will sit idle somewhere in a garage or in a warehouse and become target of destructions by the Russians. So you have to first and foremost train the soldiers that are going to man those weapons before actual movement of those weapons, you know, into Ukraine. And so that was why I told you the last time we met that the actual deployment is going to take a while. And when you consider the amount And the type of weapons that we were talking about here, these are like heaviest weaponry that you have in the arsenal of, United States military, and even that of the European allies. So it was actually going to take a while before the deployment actually takes place, because you have to have training, and then you now move the weapons where they can actually be deployed to the battlefield.
Of course, this is affecting, even though it's not being publicly admitted, but this is affecting the counter-offensive that had been talked about that Ukraine was supposed to mount. This issue of the late deployment of these weapons on which Ukraine was relying, plus the issue of weather. My last guest also talked about the fact that the weather on the ground does not support the deployment of this heavy equipment. As someone who served, is that true? Is that true? How much of an impact do things like that have on plans like counteroffensives?
It does have a significant impact on military operations, because the ground usually is very soft. And so, maneuver movement will be very difficult, particularly when you have those kind of heavy equipment, because, people think about military operations that you always have to follow tarred roads and stuff like that. That is not always the case. As a matter of fact, most times tarred roads are booby traps that you want to even avoid. So most often than not, they like to follow, muddy trackways and, even bushes and stuff like that. So in this kind of weather, where the ground is so soft, movement of those maneuver equipment and vehicles are usually very, very, difficult. And so, yes, it does have some significant impact on that kind of military operation.
I must get your opinion on this. So many people were, I don't know whether to say were scared or, were quite apprehensive when they saw what China was doing around the Taiwanese Straits over this Easter weekend following the Taiwanese president's visit to the U.S. Speaker. And they've made it clear, I mean, even if you take a look at what the drills were, that they have no intention of allowing Taiwan to do anything. And to, in case you were doubting, they've warned now that any move in that direction, they will stop it. Again, is this another potential flashpoint for you to the extent that, it's getting more and more busy in the Taiwanese Straits? Lots and lots of weapons are now there.
Absolutely. Anytime you have, this kind of, movements, there's always that danger, that potential danger, for a mistake that could, escalate into some kind of unplanned, outcome. But I have to also tell you that the Chinese people are very, very tactical and strategic in the way they are handling the situation with Taiwan. I don't think that their president is going to, make some kind of reckless decision like you saw the Russian president did. They are more focused, on growing their economy, trade, cooperation, and at the same time, even continue building their military. Sure, Taiwan is going to be a flashpoint, but that will be a future flashpoint. I don't see anything happening in the immediate because the Chinese president, like I said, is a very careful person. They know what they want. They don't want to make the kind of mistake that Russia made and destroyed the economy that they've been building for years.
Indeed. Before I let you go, I must ask one final question, which is, we in all of this scenario and in many of the places, that all of these things are happening, Ukraine, in Taiwan, and so on and so forth, there is this issue of tactical nuclear weapons. Analysts like yourself and those who have served in the military will tell us that the nuclear weapons themselves, anybody using it knows that it's mutually assured destruction. Everybody will disappear. But there is the belief that the tactical ones, which are supposedly smaller and the impact is limited, can be used without that result. Is that fantasy?
Well, I personally, I don't see anybody in the immediate, taking such a risk. Because what is the guarantee that if you use tactical nuclear weapon, that your foe is going to use tactical nuclear weapon? Your foe, your foe could even go much harder on you than what you have done. So the tactical nuclear thing, I don't see anybody making that mistake. You're only going to have all those kind of rallying about use of tactical nuclear weapon because, of course, it's a strategy. If your enemy hears that, look, this is what you want to do, or that you have the capacity to do this, that would be a form of deterrence. It may be doing carrying out one or two intended activities, but I don't see anybody using it because it is not guaranteed that if you use it on me, I'm going to use tactical nuclear weapon on you. I can go all out on you if you use that on me.
Indeed. A grim situation. Captain Bish Johnson, as always, thank you for your time on the program this morning. It was educative listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And when we return, Russia and Ukraine exchange more than 200 troops in a prisoner swap. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Time to take a look at the business angle to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And for that, Laddie Williams joins me. Morning, Laddie.
Good morning.
A tanker,
Yeah.
a Russian tanker, is nearby here.
Very close.
Unloading crude in Ghana.
Yeah.
Now, many people wonder, how is that possible? Because Ghana is also supposed to be producing some level of crude and all
Exactly.
of that. What's that about?
Even though they're not as big as, their big brother, which is Nigeria.
Or anything like Russia.
Exactly. We know that, most countries now are enjoying, cheap oil from Russia. We've seen how, India and China have exploited these prices. It's a good price. So obviously you want to, buy something that's lower than, market rate. And we see how oil is actually, starting to inch up, gradually.
On the international market, right.
So at this time, definitely you want to get, cheap oil. So this was actually, headed for West Africa, but there was some confusion, about where it was actually going to exactly. And now there were indications that it was actually coming from Kazakhstan, but apparently, it turns out it's actually from Russia. So it docked there for about, since February, that's that shipment. So they were trying to, sort out, issues about where it's actually coming from. So that's why it was there for this long. And, definitely some national security issues right there in Ghana. They had to be sure exactly where it was coming from. And they found out, okay, yeah, it's Russia, about 600,000 barrels, of crude. And finally, it's docked and unloaded, into Ghana. We see the buyer there is Plating Gas Oil. Right. As a small company in Ghana there. They also have, a small refinery, so they're,
this 600,000 barrels will keep them in business for a bit.
Exactly, because they're going to need about 6 months to, convert all of that. So
yes, exactly.
And it's some profit.
And at a good price, too.
At a good price, So we can't be mad at them, even though we know a lot of countries are quite, trying to tread carefully.
With the issue of secondary sanctions.
Exactly.
So, we'll see what Europe does with that now that the information is out.
Exactly.
Now, Nigeria, as you said, the big brother, Nigeria's imports from Russia have also gone up. 39 billion, in spite of everything we have been told and we know about the war.
Yeah.
And what are these? What is in this?
And it's a big jump, about 85%, from the previous year.
That's before the war.
Before the war, So it's quite, interesting that, even with the war, we're seeing an increased
in this trade
import, coming from Russia into Nigeria. And apparently, Russia is a big supplier of fish. To Nigeria. We see we imported about 6.27 billion naira of herrings. That's a type of forage fish from Russia in 2022. It's also blue whiting about 2.77 billion naira worth imported from Russia in the second quarter of 2022. Also imported malt, 1.25 billion naira worth of malt, and sulfur, about 517.90 million naira worth of sulfur. That's all from Russia.
Now, these are all things that most people don't even think about.
Exactly.
Because when you talk about imports from Russia, the first thing that comes to everybody's mind is wheat.
Exactly.
But you haven't mentioned wheat.
And yeah, I've not even mentioned wheat.
You've not mentioned wheat at all.
Because at the end of the day, when you hear fish, you know we have fish in Nigeria.
Yeah, so you're wondering what exactly are we getting?
I don't eat out of, Titus and, croquant, but, hearing these types of fish, we have people who have taste for, that kind of fish.
The exotic.
It's quite exotic, fish at the end of the day. So it's a big jump, but interestingly, Ukraine, we're not getting that much. Checking the data there,
right.
Not much coming from Ukraine. So it shows that at the end of the day, with the two countries, Ukraine is getting the negative impact.
Part of this, all of this,
trade.
and the Russians are, of course.
The Russians are still making, sales at this point, looking at this big jump.
Speaking about, losing, the Ukrainians, the grain crisis that they also have has showed that the global economy is also being affected negatively by that crisis, particularly as it references grains, right?
Exactly.
Well, to the tune of about $1.6 billion.
$1.6 billion. Big number, but some would say
in the scheme, in the scheme of things, it's not really that much.
Exactly.
Some would expect that it would be a lot more.
It'll be more, but this study is actually, estimating that that's what, it costs, the global economy in 1 year, but when you look deeper into it, they're seeing that it's much more than that, and there's a chance that it's going to, get even more, going forward, that if this escalation continues. Because now, we're seeing that now we've seen Russia now, having some issues, with the whole grain deal, and they're already, voicing
that out, and they're refusing to extend for 4 months. They're saying 2 months, and
And now we're seeing, wheat prices starting to inch up, gradually, reacting to, some of these concerns.
This
uncertainty, what we're seeing when it comes to this grain deal. But we're all hoping that, it's extended, hopefully.
Hopefully, because that will have an impact on us here. And speaking of impact on us, it's been a long weekend.
Oh, yes.
How are the markets doing this morning?
Yeah, so global markets not looking so bad. It's practically green across board, this time, even though we know most of the investors are looking for that inflation data, for the U.S. coming out to see how far the U.S. Fed is going to react, rate hikes, going forward. So all eyes are on that. But we're seeing the markets green. We're seeing, in Europe, DAX is up by 0.53%. We see Asia markets are up. The U.S. futures markets are also, marginally up this morning, even though they closed positive. Yesterday, we're seeing Bitcoin breaking new grounds, $30,000 this morning, last seen in June in 2022. So the markets are looking quite good, looking like investors are throwing caution to the wind, but who knows if this will actually...
whether the Feds will bring them back to heel very quickly.
Exactly, to reality. So we're definitely watching those markets. It's looking really good, after the Easter holidays.
All right, then, Ladi. Of course, Ladi and the team will be back right after this program with the update on all the news from everywhere else following the long Easter holidays and how your money has worked for you during that period. Thanks, Ladi.
Thank you.
And finally on the program, more than 200 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers have returned home in a prisoner swap. Russia's defense ministry says that 106 Russian soldiers were released from Ukrainian custody as part of an agreement with Ukraine. On the other hand, Andriy Yermak, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's chief of staff, says that Russia freed 100 Ukrainian prisoners. Neither announcement mentioned whether any intermediaries were involved in the agreement. Mr. Yermak said in a statement published in Telegram that some of the Ukrainian soldiers have severe injuries and illnesses, adding that the latest of the sporadic prisoner swaps in the war that started in February 2022 was not an easy one. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. Do have a pleasant day ahead. Good morning. My name is Ladi Akeridoluale.